ready for questions. Sophie, I'll leave it to you.
Members who will be presenting on the topic of Gestalt language processing and whether that is or what the evidence base is for that. It's been a big topic in our SLP circles and certainly getting into our ABA conversations. And I think it is up there as one of the most popular topics that people post questions about on our Facebook page. So I am, for one, excited to learn more from our fellow board members tonight on this topic. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three presenters, and then they will get started with their presentation.
Can I interrupt you really quick,
is
Sophie?
A speech-language pathologist.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. When I go into full screen, I can't see any of the presenters anymore. So just let me know when you want me to go into full screen.
Okay.
And Sophie, do you mind if I just quickly jump in here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Do you want to do your CE announcement?
Yes, please. So
go ahead. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. So I'm Janine Shapiro. I'm the CEU director for SPABA. And the people, we did a little bit differently this time because we didn't use Eventbrite. So if you had wanted CEUs, you probably have emailed me to let me know. If you haven't, and you do want CEUs for tonight's presentation, then if you're not a SPABA member, though we encourage you to become one, then you can just make a $10 purchase of tonight's CEU through the SPABA website, and then email me that you've done that, and I will follow with your CEU. Now, please keep your cameras on if you can. If you cannot, then just email me and I will send you 3 questions just to answer. So it's not required, but I just have to do my due diligence that, that the sound is on. And then lastly, at the conclusion of tonight's presentation, if you want a CEU, only if you need a CEU, then I need you to put in the chat or email me some feedback. It can be 1 word, it can be great. If you have feedback that you don't want anyone else to see, then just email it to me. And again, I'm going to put my email now in the chat. So without further ado, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Janine. Appreciate you putting that out there. I will, since we went into announcement mode, also just note, please feel free to type in any comments or questions into the chat during tonight's presentation, and our presenters are going to be leaving some time at the end for questions. So I will be following those, and then we'll make sure that we can address those questions if they don't get answered in the presentation at the end. I'm going to go ahead and jump back into our presenter introductions, and then we will get started with the presentation. So we have, like I said, our 3 presenters tonight. I'm now also getting out of full screen mode. Sari Risen is a speech language pathologist and board certified behavior analyst. She has extensive experience working with individuals with complex communication needs, including individuals with autism spectrum disorders and individuals with intellectual disabilities. She's experienced in providing treatment to improve speech clarity using a variety of methods, including dynamic temporal and tactile cueing, the Kaufman speech-to-language protocol, and prompt. Having conducted her master's thesis in the area of augmentative and alternative communication, Sari has always had a strong interest in this area and continues to have a strong focus on serving individuals in her practice. Heather Forbes is an assistant professor of communication science. She is dually credentialed speech-language pathologist and to improve communication for children with autism and other developmental disabilities, with a particular focus on augmentative and alternative communication interventions and interprofessional and collaborative service delivery. Heather has previously presented on topics related to evidence-based speech and language intervention, communication instruction by parents, and interprofessional collaboration. And our third presenter is Tracie Lindblad, who's a dually credentialed speech-language pathologist and board-certified behavior analyst with over 35 years experience working within school settings, not-for-profit agencies, and private practice. She has extensive experience working with children, youth, and adults with developmental disabilities, severe problem behavior, ASD, complex communication needs, and dual diagnosis. Tracie blends her skills from speech-language pathology, education, behavior analysis, research, and business to increase client outcomes, and has worked with clients and companies throughout North America, Europe, and the UK. Tracie is actively involved in applied research across the fields of speech-language pathology and behavior analysis, and has been fortunate to be involved in large cross-sector research studies involving individuals with developmental disabilities, autism, and aphasia. She also currently serves as a director on a number of boards for organizations in Ontario. So we have 3 wonderful presenters tonight. I will pass it over to them to get started.
Great, you can go to the next slide.
So is this where we're doing polls?
Yes, I believe we wanted to start with some polls. Nikia, do you have those polls of our audience?
Can you see the poll or not?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I can see the poll, but can't click on it. Oh, sorry, it's because you have to see all of them first.
Yeah, you have to, there's 3 questions.
There are 3 questions to answer.
There to for a minute.
Nikia, can you see the outcomes?
I can. So far, we have about 38% are dual certified, 18% are SLPs, 40% are BCBAs. We don't have any special ed teachers. We have an RBT, it looks like, or a behavior tech para. We have an OT BCBA. We have about question number 2 is, what is your GLP NLA background? It's a multiple choice question. I've heard of it, but I don't know a lot. That's about 73%. 2%, which is 1 person, is certified. 13%, which is 6 people, have had formal training. And how did you hear about it? 100% of the people have answered. We have 48 people on right now, just so you know. We'll have 49 in a minute. 7 people have had college and university coursework or heard it through their coursework. 21 through a colleague, 19 through social media, 9 a parent. 9 people are a parent of a consumer. So we have like 2 people who haven't answered. So are we good?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have not heard a lot about it. And most of them have heard it through, oh, thank you. Now we got it. Most of them have heard it through, a lot of people don't know a lot about it, and most of them have heard it through informal places, something like a colleague or social media, which is pretty common, I think, for this topic. So that's really useful. Thank you all. All right, should we go to the next slide? You ready, Sari?
Yeah. All right. So, what is GLP NLA? And before I get into that. I'll just talk about why we have a slash between NLA and GLP. So GLP, a lot of people use that to refer to the whole thing we're talking about. GLP really just refers to a type of learner that Marge Blanc refers to. It's a Gestalt language processor. And for those individuals, Marge Blanc has posited that they go through a type of language learning different than what we expect of most learners, that involves learning through gestalts, basically. So NLA is the theory of how they learn, and then there's also what Marge calls the NLA protocol, which includes the theory about how this learning happens, as well as intervention recommendations based upon that. So this theory posits that some children learn language as Gestalt. So that means rather than starting with individual words, which they then use as building blocks to build longer utterances, these children start by producing long Gestalts, like multi-word utterances strung together, that through proper environmental supports are then broken down to allow them later to produce their own novel utterances. And then these children are posited to go through a type of learning. This type of learning is called Gestalt learning style, or I believe now, based on an article Marge has written, she's calling it Gestalt language development. So there were 4 stages that were initially posited to take place for a Gestalt language learner. It was Dr. Barry Prezant, who first mentioned these stages. And then Marge Blanc adapted Prezant's description, and she added 2 more stages at the end of the cycle, at the ends of the progression. She added stages 5 and 6 to describe more about the more advanced grammar that can be learned. So next slide. And so based on the idea that these children learn in a different way, so initially Ann Peters, and I'll talk about her a little bit later, she talked about the idea that she used the term analytic versus Gestalt language learners. So analytic is how we usually assume people learn. They learn single words, put them together. People who are Gestalt language learners, as I said, kind of go in the opposite way with learning chunks first, according to this idea. So based on the idea that some children learn as Gestalt language learners, for those people who are not analytic, a specific bunch of intervention strategies have been posited. Now, there's no clear mechanism for a problem with this kind of protocol is that we don't have any clear mechanism posited or researched for how this learning style is supposed to occur. We have ideas that if you produce gestalts, the child will mitigate them or extract from them specific words, but we don't really have a mechanism posited for why that would happen or how. And we don't have criteria for how a GLP is to be classified. Like what criteria do you have to meet for your speech pathologist to label you a Gestalt language processor? To the point that some children who are not even speaking at all, so not using vocal speech at all, are sometimes being classified as a GLP. And according to Barry Prezant, Dr. Barry Prezant, in his 1983 article, he indicated that he feels that all children with autism might be Gestalt language processors, which kind of, makes it confusing to know which of my clients would be one, like for a practitioner who's trying to figure that out. Next slide. So I think
So, you heard a little bit, Sari presents to you a little bit about what NLA is and some of the claims made by NLA proponents. And I'm here to talk about the kinds of research needed to support those claims. So in other words, what evidence should we require as practitioners before believing those claims? So before jumping on this bandwagon. And so this is where my part kind of comes in. So go ahead, Nikki, you can move to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about those 2 big claims that are made. I need you to know that both of these claims are mutually exclusive. So one doesn't have to be true in order to accept the other, and they actually require different levels of evidence. But at the same time, both of these claims are made by Marge Blanc. So one of the claims is that autistic children who are GLPs naturally develop language in a sequence of these 6 stages that Sari talked about. And then the other claim is that certain therapeutic practices support progression of the autistic GLPs through the 6 stages of natural language acquisition. Go ahead, Nikia. So let's talk about that first claim. But before analyzing that claim, there are a lot of things that we need to know. And Sari hinted at this. The claim has a lot of terms in it, okay? So one of those terms is Gestalt language processor. So what constitutes a GLP? How do I know one if I see it? This needs to be clarified. So this is a term that needs to be operationalized at this point. Another term we have to question when it comes to this claim is, what does naturally mean? It's called natural language acquisition, right? So Prasant did give us a hint about what this means. He suggested that this development through language will happen without intervention, at least for those children who he says have cognitive potential. I'm not sure what that means, but he does suggest that this natural development happens without interventions. It's just a different kind of development that happens for Gestalt language processors than does for other children. And then what exactly qualifies a linguistic utterance as within a particular stage? So how do I know when an utterance is a stage 1 utterance versus a stage 2 utterance versus a stage 3 utterance? Marge provides very little guidance on this within her book. She just said we need to, quote, know the child's linguistic history, which is kind of fuzzy to me. What do we need to know about the history? And how much of the history is sufficient? Because remember, we are seeing children as practitioners who might be coming to see us for the first time. And so we might be able to question family members, but how much of that history do we need to know, and what is that history? So even before delving into the kind of research evidence that's needed to support this claim, we have to be able to understand what the terms within the claim itself means. And at this point, I'm not exactly sure of the answer to that. So go ahead and move to the next slide, Nikia. So what kind of research is required to support this claim? It requires quantitative developmental research, and we want to answer the question, over time, does the language of autistic GLPs sequentially pass through the 6 stages, presumably without intervention? That's what this claim is saying. So go ahead, Nikia. So there are 2 broad types of quantitative developmental research. One is cross-sectional. So cross-sectional research measures a certain outcome for participants of different ages, but at the same point in time. So go ahead and to the next one, Nikia. So one example is this study conducted by Bates and colleagues. They measured vocabulary growth in the first 2.5 years of life. But they did this by sampling about 1,800 children who were between the ages of 8 months to 2.5 years. And then they reported quantitative features of their current vocabularies at that time for their current ages. So this is what cross-sectional research is. Unfortunately, this type of research isn't possible in our case because the NLA stages aren't associated with a particular age or developmental marker within the autistic population. Next one. Then there's also longitudinal developmental research where we follow the same participants over a longer span of time. Go ahead. An example of this type of research is Bonvillian and colleagues' study in 1983. This is an interesting study. I actually review it with some of my students in class. They follow 7 infants with deaf parents, and they follow all of those infants for 16 months. And then they quantitatively reported various aspects of their language development. So that's a longitudinal developmental study. Now, longitudinal research is appropriate to answer our developmental question about these stages, but it's appropriate with a few caveats, okay? We must have quantitative outcomes. So reliability or inter-observer agreement can be measured. So we need things like percentage of utterances within each stage over time for the participant or for the child. What percentage of utterances are within each stage over time? Otherwise, how do we know children are actually progressing sequentially through these stages if we don't have that information? We also have to have methods that describe data collection and data reporting. So they have to clearly describe data collection and data reporting methods, including how many of the collected language samples are actually being reported. So are we reporting all of the language samples, or is it just one or two of them that are cherry-picked? I think what's notable is that both of these requirements are conspicuously missing in Marge Blanc's 2012 book, where she claims the evidence is entailed. So, okay, you can go to the next slide. So, just for this first claim that autistic children who are GLPs naturally develop language in a sequence of 6 stages, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that they show this unique pattern of language development is extraordinary, given the wide diversity in this population. As practitioners, we should require sufficient evidence to believe this claim, or we need sufficient evidence to be able to believe the claim. Go ahead, Nikki. Yep. All right. So what about the second claim? Again, these claims are mutually exclusive. You don't need evidence for one to claim the other one is true. So the second claim is that certain therapeutic practices support progression through the 6 stages. Now, this seems strange that therapy is needed if the process is natural. But like I said, the claims are mutually exclusive, even though both are made by Marge Blanc. So this claim requires evidence from experimental research that answers the question, do the therapeutic practices cause children to progress through those 6 stages? Go ahead, Nikia. All right, so of course, the primary advantage of experimental research is control. So we can determine causal relations, that the procedures cause the outcomes. So things like qualitative research and anecdotes aren't designed to support claims about effectiveness or efficacy. I'll repeat that again. Qualitative research and anecdotes aren't designed to support claims about effectiveness or efficacy of a practice. So we need to recognize that there are certain designs that are there to support those claims, and that is an experimental design. Go ahead, Nikia. All right, so there are also 2 broad types of experimental research. The first is group experiments, but this is complicated for NLA research. And because the population size of GLPs is unknown. So group experiments require large samples to represent the population, and we don't know what the population size is for that group. Outcomes for GLP can't be easily measured through 1 or 2 administrations of a standardized assessment. In fact, Blanc recommends using language samples. Now, we could use language sample analysis in group experiments if the language sample analysis can be standardized. But like I said, it's unlikely because population sizes are unknown and group experiments are difficult and costly. Go ahead, Nikia. So then we come to single case experiments. Now, single case experiments are feasible, practical, controlled, and relatively cheap, and they can be reasonably carried out by practitioners with research support. Unfortunately, I'm unaware of any plans by proponents to conduct single case experiments on NLA, and I've actually offered to support those experiments to no avail. But this is one way that we could gain actual experimental evidence to support the claim. Go ahead, Nikia. So again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? So the claim that certain procedures progress children through the 6 stages is unique. You'll hear a little later that some of these practices aren't new, but the proposed outcome of the practices is new. It's unique to claim that practices progress these particular children through the 6 stages. Again, as practitioners, we should require sufficient evidence to believe that claim.
Right, so I think this is me. So we're going to go through the various types of evidence that have been posited by individuals who are proponents of NLA as evidence for NLA being an appropriate treatment or an appropriate protocol. So we'll start, Nikki, if you go to the next slide, start with Ann Peters. Oh, I think we went backwards. So Dr. Ann Peters is a linguist, and she initially used the word Gestalt, language learner, to describe a participant she was following. It was a toddler, and this toddler in her language samples, much, or it might have even been all of what she said initially was, I believe it was a boy actually, all of what he said was long utterances that we wouldn't have expected him to have the single words for. So for example, and sometimes it wasn't words, it was intonation. So for open the door, he would say, oh, oh, oh. And from that, she gleaned that some children are, as I said before, are not analytic language learners. They don't learn one word and gradually increase to multi-word utterances. Instead, they first learn multi-word utterances, and then these are broken down into smaller words. Now, does this source provide evidence for the NLA theory? Well, not really. It's not experimental. There was not really any systematicity in how the language samples were taken, and I don't know that it went on long enough to show that the child did end up using single words, but I could be wrong about that piece. Most importantly, does it support using NLA-based strategies to treat individuals who are not progressing with their language? No, because there were no interventions used. She was just describing what she saw. Next slide. So, oh, I think did we miss an Ann Peters? I think
It's next. There's
okay.
another Peter.
Oh, okay, sorry. So then Dr. Prezant in his 83 article, it's a descriptive article. So first he talks about different kinds of echolalia, and then he talks about the idea that many or maybe all children with autism are GLP learners, so Gestalt language processors, and he posits 4 stages for going through the learning. Is this, good evidence for NLA? I don't think so. The examples he provided are just that. They're examples, they're anecdotes. And does this provide evidence that using an NLA protocol improves language for individuals who need treatment? No, it doesn't talk about that at all. Next slide, please. So back to Dr. Ann Peters. So in this document, she describes both her own language learners that she followed, as well as others that she had seen in the literature. Again, talking about how they learned language first in these longer chunks and then later produced single word utterances. So again, it does not provide evidence for NLA in any way. It wasn't systematic research. There was no experimentation. And does it tell us anything about whether intervention would be helpful based on NLA? No, that wasn't a discussion at all. So then we come to Marge Blanc's work in 2012. This is a book that she published. In her book, she first describes the 6 stages of NLA, and she gives examples of language samples for clients that she has followed at each of these stages, and provides recommendations for what you should do at each of these stages to support a child's language development. Her language samples there are many of them, and some of them are long and, you know, nicely done in a way, but there was no systematization in terms of, I always take a language sample, you know, at this time for all the children, and I analyze this number of language samples. But she doesn't talk about that at all. They're just some language samples. And so we don't know, for example, was the child saying this stuff at this time, but was he also capable of saying these other things? And so we don't know what's going on with the progression. So her data would be best classified as anecdotes due to lack of systematicity in how they were recorded and presented. And so based on what she describes in her book, unfortunately, we can't draw any conclusions between the dependent variable, so the improvement or the change in a child's language, and any interventions that were provided. And a big problem is that the outcome measures for knowing whether a child has made improvement have not been clearly defined. So this also does not give us high quality evidence that the NLA protocol is a successful method or an effective method for helping our individuals that need help with their language. Next slide. Next slide.
You don't see it? The
Oh, is it
2023?
there?
Next one.
Yeah, 2023, right? Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I didn't notice the change. Okay, so recently an article has come out. Marge Blanc wrote it with a couple of other authors. So it kind of summarizes what I've been saying today. I found it really helpful to see it because for prior presentations, I had to pick material up from a bunch of different places and put them together, but Marge did a great job here of kind of summarizing everything. So she describes, or the authors describe the history of NLA, they describe the 6 stages, they talk about what support should be provided to a learner at each stage, so basically what intervention should be done at each stage, and they include some quotes from lived experiences of individuals who are GLPs. But it doesn't mention, again, any experimental evidence. We really can't draw any conclusions from this about the effect of interventions on individuals with autism or autistic learners. Next slide. This is Tracie.
Yes. So we've been hearing a lot about what is out there in terms of GLP and NLA resources, and are these of sufficient quality and quantity to lend support to this practice? So we've heard that there's no operationally defined terms. The interventions are not manualized in terms of procedures, and by manualized we don't mean really step-by-step onerous things. We mean you can manualize interventions that still have a lot of variability in it, still have a lot of clinician choice, what types of play, what types of materials, what types of stimuli, but manualized that everyone who's doing it follows a similar progression and has some structure to it so that they know what they're doing. We also show that there's really not really support for implementing this in practice. So I have not been to a training, but I'd be interested to know, was there coaching? Was there feedback? Did they follow more of a behavior skills training approach to training you to do this? Because really, when we look at all of the information that's out there, starting from very early on, there hasn't really been anything other than, material she wishes to share or other people wish to share, but we really don't know. We don't have it from other people that have done this, other practitioners in different parts of the world. So we really are missing some things. So where does it leave us? It leaves us by saying we need to use an evidence-based practice process to determine what works. So in this case, GLP, who does it work for and when does it work? And we don't have that information to date. Nikia, next slide. So we have statements that we hear from practitioners that say, well, in the absence of evidence, we need to implement things that don't have evidence. Another statement, we can't wait for the evidence. And so that's fine, again, but we have to, as as behavior analysts, as speech and language pathologists, as regulated health professionals, we are required to collect evidence then, our own evidence with our own clients, to actually verify that you have some type of indication that this intervention is being successful. Next one, Nakia. So another thing that we hear is that, well, GLP or NLA as per protocol are based on a lot of things that are already evidence-based and in existence. So things that none of us would argue with. So child-led, get to know their motivators, use reinforcing stimuli, do play-based, so all of these things, it's true that, they're already there. But again, what we want to think about is, what is it then that GLP adds to this mix? What is it that they're purporting that is the secret ingredient that causes these children to transition or move through this natural progression of 6 stages? So what they've done is packaged known interventions with other things and claiming that these other GLP types of procedures are actually leading to the outcome. And we actually don't know that. It muddies research as well. It muddies research because it causes confusion with practitioners, with stakeholders, with parents. And the procedures to date, the GLP and NLA procedures, have not been shown to produce outcome through those 6 stages. So to date, we're talking 40 years since this was raised by Ann Peters and Barry Prezant, and we don't have any indication that these types of procedures that Marge Blanc is talking about actually make you progress through the stages. In fact, very early on, Dr. Prezant says some children with echolalia who he thinks are GLP may not progress through the stages, but it's pretty circular reasoning because he blames it on their poor cognitive potential. So again, it's what do we have and should we be doing this? So Nakia, next slide. Other concerns about GLP and NLA are that, if we look at it from a lens of behavior analysis or those learning principles that we know exist, we actually might be reinforcing gestalts that do not have communicative intent. Or in other words, as behavior analysts would say, that it's stereotypy. There is no communicative intent, although there may be a function to it, it's not for communication. And also the assumption is that perhaps all gestalts have communicative intent. And we don't know because it's the term gestalt is not operationally defined. So I don't know if we could ever get IOA right now without the operational definition among us that would class the sayings and the words of individuals as a gestalt or not. Marge classes single words as gestalts. And so again, you're positing communicative intent and function behind that, but I don't know, is that we don't have good agreement, and we certainly don't have anything to guide us in that. Next one, Nakia.
All right, so we're here going to be talking about the various components of the NLA protocol, so the intervention piece, and what research would say about whether these are likely to work, and also what does plausibility say about whether these things could possibly be effective. Now, it looks like we've missed a slide because there are some slides that precede this, no? Huh. Okay,
No.
so I will say, maybe we're getting to them later, but I will quickly say, in case they've exited the presentation by accident, there are some really great pieces of the intervention that I think we all would agree with, all of us here who are SLPs and BCBAs. So one of the things is being really careful to select activities that the child highly enjoys. I think we'd all agree with that. So basically doing preference assessments and incorporating that. Also following the lead of the child to an extent. Now, most of us, I don't think, who are more in the ABA camp, we wouldn't always be following the child's lead. We do it in the right, when that's the best way to teach. But surely following the child's lead as much as possible, doing things in as natural way as possible is always what we try to do. So those pieces are great. But then there's some pieces of some components of Marge's recommendations that I have some concerns with. So one is the way in which the teaching happens. So, if you're using an approach like initially teaching a child to request, you say a word and your expectation is that the child echoes that word and then you provide your reinforcer. So we're looking for some sort of response usually from the child. In indirect language stimulation, the clinician or the adult, if it's a parent, is saying various things in the child's presence. Usually you're trying to say things about what you think the child is currently interested in, and you don't have any expectation that the child will respond. And it's not that this would never work. There's very little research on it in general, and particularly in the autism population. And what has been found from the small number of studies is that this can work for children, or seems to be more effective for a child if that child already has some language skills, and if they're more responsive in their interaction style, and less so for children that don't already have those skills. And that makes sense based on what we've all seen with our children. Some other factors that haven't been researched, but that I would imagine are likely predictive factors for when indirect language stimulation would work would be an individual who pays a lot of attention to their play partner and has some observational learning skills. So in the absence of that, the idea that an adult standing in the room and saying various sentences, or later on in the approach, you'd be saying words without any sort of expectation of a response, to me, that's unlikely to have efficient and effective effects. Next slide. Here's another recommendation. So in stage 3, at stage 3, the individual is now producing some single words and doing a little bit of their own word combination. And Marge says that we need to stay at this stage as long as possible. It's important to model all possible types of word combinations before leaving this stage. So I find this kind of confusing. First of all, what is long? How long is long? And really, how do we know that staying at this stage is likely to improve the effectiveness when moving to stage 4? So I think that we're lacking a mechanism of action here, plausible mechanism of action. Next slide. So now we talked about the how to teach, and this is the what to teach. So in stage 1 and 2, rather than trying to teach single words, the idea is to model full sentences. No empirical evidence that is likely to be helpful for many of the kids that I think many of us have seen. We've seen the effects of a parent modeling long utterances. So, do you want water, Johnny? So, Johnny, when he wants water, we'll say, do you want water, Johnny? And so we're teaching parents to back up to single word initially. We don't have evidence that not doing so, that giving them these longer utterances is going to lead to what Marge says, which is that they will begin to extract words from our utterances and use them in their own novel utterances, first as single words and then in their own novel utterances later on. That's why I said no plausible mechanism of action has been posited for that idea. And we do have evidence to the contrary, that modeling single words with direct elicitation procedures for our population does lead to good results. We also have, sorry if I passed that last slide. We also do have research showing that we do have good procedures for teaching kids, once they have single word utterances, to combine them to produce novel utterances. We do have literature supporting ways to do that. And then again, back to the how to teach. So in stage 1 and 2, Marge recommends that we model what she calls mitigable gestalts. So these are sentences that begin with let's, I'm, and it's, and we are and look at. So let's would be like, let's play in the playground, let's jump. So we model these various sentences, and the child may imitate them right away, or perhaps they don't. Perhaps they'll use these later on, she says. Again, no evidence that these particular phrases hold any particular importance, that using these sorts of sentence starters make our sentences more mitigable. And again, this is a recommendation to use indirect language stimulation. The problems with that have been stated already. Next slide.
Oops.
And this is, oh, sorry. Where are we? Over here? Okay. No,
No.
it keeps moving.
There.
Okay. So this was, sorry, I thought these were earlier on. So again, these are the parts of the components of the protocol that I think all of us here likely agree with, at least us as presenters, but I think most people would. So again, we want to engage them in as fun an experience as possible. Marge uses the term pain-free, regulated, and happy. So we want to put the child in a pain-free, regulated, and happy state. And I think that goes along nicely with Dr. Hanley's idea of, oh, I'm blanking on it. Can someone throw it in? Common, what is it?
HRE, I just put it in.
Yeah, right, thank you. Happy, relaxed, and engaged. Yeah, so I think those go along really nicely together. And then make observations of your clients, your child's fascinations and their joys. Yes, that's basically doing a very good preference assessment. I think we'd all agree with that. Another big piece of what Marge recommends is what she calls physical supports, and she means that we should be engaging them in physical play and be animated and fun. And yes, for many of our learners, physical play is highly reinforcing, and it provides great opportunities for social sensory routines. So yeah, we're all happy about these things. Okay, and here's a big problematic piece, a big problematic component, in my opinion. And Tracie referred to this before. So we are supposed to assume that all scripts have communicative intent, and we're supposed to look for hidden messages in these scripts. Now, apparently Marge has recently stated to one of us that she doesn't think all scripts would be, but in her training, she does talk about the importance of doing this actually for all scripts. So it's possible she's having, kind of rethinking it. A big problem with this is that we are making decisions about what to do in therapy based on things that someone is saying, because we've assumed that there's communicative intent to it. And I'll give you an example. She had a client who had very limited language, and he had a quote that he liked Pinocchio. So he produced a quote about always let your conscience be your guide. I don't know that it was that exact quote, but I believe it was. So that was his script that he would say a lot. And so when he said it to her once, Marge decided that now he wants to learn about his conscience, and spent a few of his sessions, or at least one session, talking to him about his conscience. But from seeing this learner, I mean, we can only make guesses because she doesn't provide a lot of information about the child's profile. It did not look like his other skills would support the idea that he was, interested in hearing about his conscience, or about what a conscience is, and that he'd likely benefit from a discussion on that. So I think a lot of wasted time came from that. And so I think, being careful to not miss communicative intent in scripts is important, but we can figure out whether there's communicative intent using functional analysis, or basically looking at the environment in which it occurs, the context in which it occurs, and then from that, over time, being able to make an educated guess about what they might be saying. But when it's so far-fetched, I really think it's dangerous to be making these assumptions. Next slide.
And Sari, sorry, I'm going to just interrupt real quick. We're at sorry, I'm West Coast here, but we're at 10 till. So far we only have had 2 questions in the chat, so I think you guys have the time to go a little longer, but I wanted to just jump in with that.
I will rush as much as I can. So some more things that come from the protocol. So we are supposed to conduct language sample analyses to determine which stage the individual is in. We're supposed to be careful about, we want to avoid modeling single words during stage 1, because those likely would be learned as Gestalt, is what is said. In stage 1 and 2, we model lots of Gestalts using those mitigable phrases. Stage 3, we want to model 2-word combinations. Stage 4, begin to model sentences that contain target grammatical structures. Stage 5 and 6, again, continuing with introducing more and more highly advanced grammar. Problems with these ideas: there's no evidence that the stages occur in typical development, and so how can we say that they're likely to occur for our population? There are unclear strategies as to how the stages should be determined. And like Heather was saying before, we would really, I think it would be interesting to take IOA data on what stage people are putting their clients in. It's very confusing, the recommendations on how to decide what stage a person is in. And then that idea, again, that modeling long utterances is going to result in the child extracting single words is quite, quite a big leap to take. And generally, there's no recommendation, no evidence for any of these recommendations.
So what are the next steps? Yeah, so the next steps are that we have to exercise caution. And part of this is asking ourselves, why is this bandwagon so enticing? After 40 years, it suddenly had a resurgence. And there's a couple of things that we've thought of as a team. And one is that it's presented as a compassionate approach, neurodiversity affirming. So we're taking the child's lead. We're affirming that they have more communicative competence that then appears appropriate for how else they present. It would give that would give the parent hope and want to engage with you in that type of in treatment. It also comes from a non-behavior analytic place. So this comes from speech language pathology, and it aligns with a more traditional nativist and social interactionist model of language development versus a Skinnerian model of language development. And so really, with the tensions between the fields, it may be that this is something that speech pathologists are holding on to because they align more with this approach. The other thing about the GLP and NLA, from what you've heard tonight and what we've learned, is really that there's little accountability for outcomes. So there really isn't anything that tells you you need to reach these certain stages at a certain time. A child needs to have a certain percentage of utterances within a certain stage, and then you move to the next stage. If you think about even a stutterer or a fluency, we know that we classify individuals as, normal non-fluency or having stuttering because there's research and there's guidelines to tell us that this percentage of output or this percentage of production means that they have reached the threshold. And we don't have any of that yet with NLA or GLP, or classifying children as GLP. So there's very, very little accountability for what you're doing. Next slide, Nakia. So what we've talked about, I've alluded to a little earlier, is that we are beholden, we are required to practice in an evidence-based way, especially for something like GLP or NLA, because when you look at the typical evidence-based triangle that speech pathologists follow, then what you're really looking at is that we don't have, at this time, good external scientific evidence. In fact, we have no scientific evidence. We have anecdote and opinion. And so you're missing one whole side of the triangle. So what you need to do then, to be sure that you're practicing in an ethical and professional way, is to then take that internal evidence. And this diamond model comes from Dr. Higginbotham. And what it says is that if you don't have the evidence that you need externally, then you need that internal evidence to know that what you're doing is effective for your client and is getting you closer to the outcomes that you expect. And so it's vitally important that if people want to put GLP and NLA into practice and classify individuals as Gestalt language processors, then they need to really practice in this evidence-based way. And it means a priori. So from the beginning, when you're speaking with your client, the parent, you should be, for informed consent, letting them know that there's no scientific evidence. It's your clinical opinion that this will be effective. You feel that client fits this type of intervention, and so that you're going to be collecting evidence along the way to support that view and support what you've determined is the right treatment for the client. Next step, next slide. So the other thing that's vitally important, when there's so little to go on and really there's not good operational definitions, there's not clear structure and manuals, and there's really not targets, goals that we can actually sort of grasp onto and work towards, it means then you have to be very careful that you are able to prove your treatment methods and outcomes. So I always, from very early on, have been taught, what would you need if you got called to court? What would you need if a complaint was made? You would need, number one, explicit criteria for classifying the person as a GLP. You would need criteria for determining the functions of the gestalts. How did you determine what that gestalt, the communicative intent was? You will need some type of manualized procedure. Next slide, Nakia. You would need defined outcomes, observable, measurable, and consistent approaches before you implemented, so that you could actually collect the data to show what you were doing and why you were doing it and what the outcomes were. So you would need explicit criteria for determining when to continue with your approach, when to modify the approach, and when to discontinue the approach. So if your approach is not working, how long is long enough to stay at a stage? How long is staying at a stage too long? You know, we hear a lot about, well, individuals are entrenched or in their environment for 18 months before they start speaking, so we have to continue to do that. No, not if there's better methods that would give them those skills sooner. Then that isn't a good reason. Next slide. So what about those people who say, I'm doing it?
Just to clarify, it is 7:59, Tracie, just so that you know.
Thank you. Thanks. So what about the people who say, I'm doing it anyway? Well, let's revisit the definition of harm for regulated health professionals. So harm means any adverse event or effect, which means slow, poor, or no change in skills, could be an indication of harm. Changes which are not the terminal outcome or are resistant to further change. So we talked about that strengthening inappropriate productions if there's no communication intent. Next slide. Also, resource allocation is considered harm. So if it's an adverse effect, so if a parent has spent their financial resources on an ineffective treatment, they could claim harm. Also, human resources. So your time, their time, if you have taken them away from another path that has clear outcomes and empirical support, then they could argue that you have harmed their child. So you really need to think about those things before you decide to do this. And next slide. So you want to avoid this. You want to implement interventions that are more favorable. So urge you to go look at the national standards reports. There are a lot of interventions, I think 28 to be exact on that report, that actually show you the treatments and interventions that have enough sufficient empirical evidence. And on the next couple slides, I think I've given you the links for those reports if you want to revisit them. And I started with the 2020 report and all the way up to a 21, to 21. So those links are there. You can go visit them, and they establish 28 focused intervention practices. And we've included the resources and references for you with links. That concludes this session. And I'm not sure if people want to stay for questions. Sophie, I'll leave